It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. The Verdict is brought to you in part by Betcher, Martin, Jean, and Jackson, when hurt people need help. Betcher, Martin, Jean, and Jackson in Ponca City. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett. My partner in crime here on the show is Kent Myers. You know Kent as one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, and another good show lined up.
The first of a series of good shows. We're going to bring to you over the next month or two, we hope most, if not all, of the major United States senatorial candidates who have thrown their hat in the ring to replace the retiring Senator Don Nichols. And today we're really pleased to have Dr. Tom Coburn come on, who will come on after the break. But we have invitations out to all of the other major candidates. We fully expect them to accept and appear. They'll appear individually. It has been a decade, Mick, since the voters of Oklahoma have had a chance to vote for a Senate position not being sought by an incumbent. So this is not something, this kind of a race is not something we see every 4 years or every 6 years. It is somewhat of a rarity because oftentimes when senators are elected to the 6-year terms, they have a tendency to stay 2 or 3 terms, and therefore their position doesn't open up much. But we have one open now, and we have a lot of good candidates in the race, and you'll meet the first one today. The race in Oklahoma has gotten a good bit of attention nationally, as a matter of fact, because of the very close division in the Senate on who has the most members, the Democrats or the Republicans. So this race not only has significance to us in Oklahoma, but nationally as well.
We'll get started. We'll meet Dr. Tom Coburn coming up next on The Verdict. Kathy Taylor, is it?
No.
But it was. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers is going to introduce our guest.
We are very pleased today to have Dr. Tom Coburn join us. Tom was the congressman from the 2nd District for 3 terms until he voluntarily retired a few years ago. Tom is a native of Muskogee. He is an OSU undergraduate in the field of business. He graduated from the University of Oklahoma Med School, where, by the way, he was president of his class. He has practiced medicine in Muskogee for a number of years, specializing in family medicine, obstetrics, and allergies. He is a candidate now for the United States Senate and is the first of what we hope will be a nice long string of candidates who are going to join us and let you get to know them so that when you go to vote at the appropriate time, either in the primary or the general election, you'll know a lot more about them. Dr. Coburn, or Tom, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here with you.
You know, Tom, we continually hear that people like to vote for the person. So basically, who is Tom Coburn? What's your personal life back in a brief history?
Born in Wyoming, but raised in Oklahoma. Had a great set of parents. Worked in business for 8 years in a family business. Got interested in medicine. Made a change in my life. Went to med school. Raised 3 daughters, 3 grown daughters, 4 grandchildren. One lives in New York, and one in Memphis, and one in Muskogee. The grandchildren are all in Muskogee, much to my happiness. Served in Congress basically because I thought people other than career politicians ought to be there. And did that pledging term limits, adamantly believe in term limits as a way to solve a lot of our problems, and left after my 3 terms were there. Went back, and I've been practicing medicine ever since. And I have a wonderful wife. I've been married 35 years. She is the person who allows me to be what I'm supposed to be, and nurtures me, and also chides me in a way that keeps me on the mark. And it's the best thing that ever happened in my life.
Just following up on that a little bit, I know you you deliver babies.
I do.
That must keep you in touch with a lot of important things that are important to all of us, family, making sure that babies come into the world healthy and so on. Do you find that rewarding?
It is the best part of my medical practice. It's getting much more difficult because of the malpractice crisis in Oklahoma, and it's going to become a very large issue in this next year. But seeing newborn life connects you with the reality that there's a creator. It couldn't be otherwise when you see that. And having the privilege of being involved in families in that way, in that very unique and special way, is probably a reward that none of us really deserve. But it's wonderful to be a participant in that and to see new life and to see the promise that of God's creation and the benefits that He has for us. And it also keeps you connected with reality and the real problems that we deal with and the real problems that every family has, and how the government can both be beneficial and also very detrimental to families.
You, after you retired from Congress, wrote a book called Breach of Trust. I know just looking at the title, one might assume that you're speaking of a breach of trust that the government has breached to the people. I have glanced through it, and I realize that the book is much broader than that. But tell us what you were going to tell, what you were trying to tell the readers in Breach of Trust.
Well, I'm convinced that if the American public really knows what's going on in Washington, that we won't have just 45% of us voting. And I thought long and hard after writing this book whether or not to publish it. But I think in our open society, there is a real disconnect between what actually happens in Washington and what we know about it. And the whole purpose of the book is to inform Americans about what is going on in Washington that's very different than what they're told on the nightly news. And it also ties in with my belief in term limits. The position of power, Abraham Lincoln said, if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And quite frankly, we're not doing well with that as a nation. And all you have to do is look what we've done since 9/11 in terms of spending. Heretofore, when our country was faced with war and mobilization, our Congresses have been very frugal with the money. Since September 11th, we've had a 28% increase in spending, and there's a reason for that. And it's careerism. It's how do I benefit myself in front of my constituency to make sure I'm reelected. And so I think term limits is a very important aspect that all our founders believed in except one, Alexander Hamilton. But the rest of them believed in it as a concept of rotation. And they understood that rotation limited the desire and the addiction to power. And that's one of our problems today.
A couple of quotes I want you to just comment on, and then we can move along real quickly. One is on your website you point out that you believe that there's a deficit of moral courage and that Congress lacks effective leadership, and you specifically refer to deficit spending. What do you mean by deficit of moral courage?
We all know that there's a difference between right and wrong, and that gets rationalized in Washington. And career politicians especially tend not to want to stand up and take the hard hits for the things that they know are right. And it's really the culture of the careerists that limits their ability to stand above the fray and say, this is black and this is white. Not everything is gray. And unfortunately, the desire to get reelected means that you don't want to offend anybody. But we have issues in our country today. For example, marriage. We ought to all be defending marriage. And we ought to be defending that institution. One is because it was ordained by God, but number two is because that's the only way we're going to have a successful future. And if we allow that institution to be undermined, and if we don't have the moral courage to stand up to the homosexual agenda in this country, then we're going to pay a very big price, not only now, but in the future. And so the question people ought to be asking, why are not all 100 senators for a constitutional amendment defining marriages between a man and a woman? And how could it be that somebody could represent anybody in the United States and not think that is something that we ought to pursue, enforce, and support at every chance? Because that's the only way children can be successful, is by that nurturing.
Let's get us to a break. Dr. Tom Coburn, candidate for United States Senate. We'll be right back. This is The Verdict. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Our guest is Dr. Tom Coburn, candidate for the United States Senate. Kent, where are we now?
I know you self-imposed a three-term limit when you were in the House of Representatives. Do you have a plan to do the same thing should you be elected to the Senate?
I do, 2 terms. And let me give you the motivation behind that. If your motivation is to represent your constituency and what's in the best long-term interest of this country, your motivation can't be conflicted with your career. And that's the rub that we have in Washington today. There's lots of good people in Washington, but they're more interested in staying in Washington than they are in terms of fixing the long-term problems of this country. And by term limiting yourself, you have set the mark that says, I'm going to be about the business of this country, not the business of my political career. And it gives you tremendous freedom to do what you think is right, and you're not beholden to a political party. You're not beholden to a philosophy. You're beholden to what is in the best long-term interests of this country. And quite frankly, that gets sacrificed very often today in what happens in Washington.
You've served as a doctor. You've served as a United States congressman. You must have some strong thoughts on Medicare.
I do. Let me pull all those together. Medicare. Today, as we speak, Medicare is insolvent. We're taking discretionary funds to pay for Part A of Medicare. That means money's coming out of the budget that would normally be for defense or health care, health research, education, all the agriculture, all the other things that the government does. We're taking money out of that now to start paying back the money that we stole from Medicare over the last 40 years. With Medicare, with Social Security, we're going to see the same thing start in 2012, 2016. We've known about these problems for 20 years. We've known that this day is coming, and yet we haven't seen the courage to fix the problems. Social Security can be fixed. There's no question it can be fixed. It'll take 70 years to fix it, but we got a portion of it needs to be privatized so that we can use what Albert Einstein called the most powerful force on earth, and that's compound interest. Social Security is very discriminatory against our African American and Latino brothers and sisters.
In what way?
The average life expectancy is below the retirement age. So if you're a black male in our country today and you work 45 years and put $70,000 into Social Security and die before you're 67, you get nothing back. If you put that same money in a passbook savings at 3.5% and compounded it every year, you'd have $600,000 or $700,000. So not only do they not get it back, they don't get the benefits of the interest earned on it because the government's stolen it. So we need to reform that, and we can protect everybody that's near retirement or close to it. We can allow anybody that wants to stay in the system to stay in the system, and yet we can allow the younger people who want to have a private portion of their Social Security put into privatization, real assets when they retire, also assets that they can will to their children. So what we've really done is we've stolen the opportunity for growth of assets and in terms of funding our future by stealing the money now and not allowing it to work for our own retirement. So those two problems can be solved. Medicare is much more difficult because we need to change a lot of the incentives in health care. We need to incentivize quality care, and mainly we need to incentivize prevention because we have a chronic disease population. As we age, those problems are going to be more difficult. But if we incentivize prevention now, then we'll save a lot of dollars on the tail end because we'll avoid a lot of the chronic diseases that we treat today.
Let me change the subject with you now and talk about foreign trade. I know that you have paid a good bit of attention to our current trade policies and think they are in a need of scrapping, tweaking, adjusting, whatever. What do you think about our current trade policy?
Well, I think we need to have free trade. Free trade benefits us. We don't get that talked about much. The free trade policies have beat up because we've lost a lot of jobs. But there's a difference between free trade and fair trade. And unfortunately, our free trade policies have been not negotiated well enough to give the American worker not protection, but an opportunity to compete on a level playing field. And we're not seeing that. We also have a very difficult problem. We had a $500 billion trade deficit If that continues, pretty soon the value of the dollar is going to decline precipitously. And we're going to see an economic shift in the world, and we can't allow that to happen. So we need to have strong negotiators to say, China, you're not going to have a $250 billion trade deficit with us. You know, we're the best market in the world. We need to use that power as the best market to get a better deal on trade policies, and we've just not done that. And you can't, and I'd make one other point. You can't expect Oklahomans or Americans to say it's okay to have free trade and then turn around and tell them they can't have free trade on pharmaceuticals, where we pay 43% more than anybody else in the world for prescription drugs, and yet we can't import drugs from Canada, Mexico, or Germany over the internet or any other way because it's not allowed, yet we're exporting our own jobs. You can't have it both ways. We got to have a trade policy that's fair to the American worker and fair to the American consumer, and we don't have that.
It appears the Republican side of the ballot is pretty crowded. On the Democratic side, it looks like Congressman Brad Carson will be the opponent for whichever Republican manages to stay alive through the primary system. Talk about Brad Carson, and is he beatable in November?
Oh, I think he's beatable. I think Brad Carson is a very smart young man. He's bright, but he has one deficit, is he wants to be in politics the rest of his life. And therefore his motivation is going to be wrong. There's another thing, is what he tells us in Oklahoma and what he does in Washington is two different things. We had that in the 2nd District for a number of years with a former congressman there.
Be specific. What's he done that you don't like?
He says he's pro-life. He's voted against pro-life almost every time he's up there. He says he's for families. He's voted to encourage homosexual relationships in Washington, D.C. in terms of the appropriation bills, domestic partnership. He says he's a conservative when it comes to spending, but he porks out as much as anybody in Washington ever does. He voted for a transportation bill that's going to cost Oklahoma $250 million over the next 6 years in plans, but he got all the pork he wanted. What I would say is it's the typical thing that we see is here's a young man who has designs for a long-term career in politics, but not interested in the long-term outlook for our children and our grandchildren. We are at the very edge of being the first generation of Americans to leave America worse off than we found it. It's never happened before. And it's happening because we're not paying attention to long run, and we're looking at short run so we can enable and rationalize ourselves to keep ourselves in office.
Let me change to the other side of the ballot, the Republican side where you are. Why you rather than Kirk Humphreys? And I'll ask you the same question about Bob Anthony in just a minute.
Well, I got into this race not because Bob Anthony and Kirk Humphreys aren't fine men, and they'll make good senators. The fact is Oklahoma needs to retain this seat, one. Number two, it's important for the nation that the Republicans control the Senate. And that's because you're going to have Charles Schumer and Hillary Clinton and Mr. Daschle and Ted Kennedy running things if we don't. I won the 2nd District for the first time in 70 years. Nobody had ever re-won that as a Republican. And my votes come from conservative Democrats. So my ability to carry Eastern Oklahoma is greater than anybody else in this race, and probably as good or greater than Brad Carson. The first vote Brad Carson will take will be to vote all those other people into majority and chairmanships. My first vote will be to not make sure they are not in the chairmanship. The other gentlemen are fine. I don't have any problems with their intellect, their character, or their ability to serve as a senator. I'd make one final point. I have a history of standing up for the things that are right, even when my party says don't do it. And we have to get away from this polarization and partisanship in our country if we're going to survive the economic things that are in front of us, as well as the war on terrorism that's going to be a 15 or 20-year war. And what we need is people that will pull us together, not divide us. And so we have to stand on principle and what's right, not what's in the party's best interest and not what's in the particular politician's best interest.
Let me interject here. We got about 30 seconds left in the show. Give you an opportunity to look into the camera, talk to the people who might or might not vote for you, and tell them why they should vote for Dr. Tom Coburn.
Well, I think my reasons for running, I write in my book the reason you ought to vote for somebody based on why they're running for office. And the second thing is what's it cost them to run for office. I'm going to be giving up a wonderful comfort, a tremendous job to be able to do what I think will need to be done to make a difference. And I'm running for our children and grandchildren. I'm not running for me. And I'm not running to be a senator. I'm running to change America. I'm running to change the culture of the Senate. We have to, starting now, make major changes and address the issues that affect this country in the long run. And if we don't, then what we are doing, we're saying the next generation doesn't matter.
Dr. Coburn, thank you for coming on The Verdict.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Kent and I'll be back.
Pleasure.
We'll have a final word right after this. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, the first of our U.S. senatorial candidates to come on.
Pretty impressive. Had not met Tom before this show, and he comes on obviously very articulate and has an idea about what he wants to do and why. A little unique that he had the moral courage, if you will, to step down after 3 terms in a district where he was probably safe for as long as he wanted to stay there. And apparently is planning to do the same thing should he be elected to the Senate. It will be interesting for our viewers to contrast Tom Coburn with the other people we've invited on and we believe will be on, including Kirk Humphreys, Bob Anthony, may or may not have Linda Murphy if she decides to get in the race. She hasn't filed her papers yet, but if she does, well, she's certainly invited. And then on the Democratic side, we'll have a couple of the contenders come on in due course. And then we have some hope, Mick, of being able to schedule, once the primary is over, if there is a runoff on the Republican side, or the Democratic side for that matter, perhaps schedule a debate pitting the 2 survivors in the primary. And then, of course, we hope for a general election.
Well, we have a couple of websites to remind you about. We typically like to pass along a website of our guest if you're interested in more information. Coburn for Senate is Dr. Tom Coburn's website. And of course, you can always go to our website, theverdict.tv. Tell us about a future guest you'd like to see right here. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.